Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's, well, it's undeniably controversial. It's had a huge impact on global discourse and has even, tragically, inspired acts of violence. We're talking about the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Now, you might have caught snippets of it, maybe in the news, scrolling social media, or even heard it pop up in political debates. But what does it really mean? Where did it actually come from? And what are the real-world implications?
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating, I think, is how this concept, which was initially, dismissed by mainstream scholars as pretty fringe, how it's managed to gain such widespread traction. And it adapts, it evolves in different countries, different contexts.
Right.
So our mission here in this deep dive is really to distill the most important bits of knowledge from the sources you've provided. We want to help you understand not just what this theory is, but crucially, why it matters and how it actually functions out there in the world. We'll look at its origins, its core claims, the specific methods used to spread it, and of course the really profound and often tragic consequences it's triggered.
Okay, so to really get into it, let's start with the foundation. How is this great replacement theory usually defined? What are its core ideas, especially thinking about its roots in France?
Right, so at its base, the Great Replacement is fundamentally a debunked white nationalist far-right conspiracy theory. It started with a French author, Renaud Camus. His original theory basically claims that ethnic French people and white Europeans more broadly are being demographically and culturally replaced.
Were replaced by whom, according to the theory?
By non-white peoples. He focuses particularly on those from Muslim-majority countries. And this replacement, he says, happens through mass migration, higher birth rates among these groups, and supposedly a drop in the birth rate of white Europeans.
And the conspiracy part.
Yes. The conspiracy angle is the claim that this isn't just happening, but it's happening with the complicity or even the active cooperation of elites. Proponents call them replacist elites.
Okay. And what was the immediate reaction from academics, from scholars to these claims?
Well, mainstream scholars were and are very clear in dismissing it. They argue the claims are rooted in, well, a basic misunderstanding of demographic statistics, just getting the numbers wrong.
Okay.
And also that it's premised upon an unscientific and fundamentally racist worldview. It's also really important to understand that while Camus himself, the author, publicly condemns violence, many scholars argue that the very way he frames it, painting non-white migrants as this existential threat to white populations, inherently contains implicit calls to violence. He still talks about needing a counter-revolt against what he calls colonization in Europe today.
Which is his term for it.
For increases in non-white populations, yeah.
And as this theory spreads, another term often seems to travel with it, remigration. That sounds quite ominous. What's that about?
It does sound ominous, and it is. Remigration is a really key associated concept. You hear it more and more in these circles. It directly calls for the forced deportations of minority communities.
Forced deportations.
Yes. It's truly chilling. Some have described it quite accurately, I think, as a kind of soft form of ethnic cleansing. And we can actually track its rise online. There was a huge surge in discussion. Over 500,000 tweets, 540,000 used that term just between April 2012 and April 2019.
Wow. And that increase, that surge in conversation around remigration, it wasn't just random, was it? It sounds like there were specific efforts behind it.
Exactly right. It wasn't random at all. That surge lines up with specific events. For instance, the first Assises de la Remigration, that's like an annual meeting on remigration organized by Generation Identity in Paris.
Generation Identity, I've heard of them.
Yes, they're a prominent group in this sphere. They actively use the term remigration in their posters, their online materials, and they've launched these big campaigns, like one specifically against the UN Global Migration Pact. They coordinated these campaigns using encrypted chat rooms, things like Telegram and Discord.
So quite organized then.
Very. For example, Martin Sellner, who leads the Austrian branch of Generation Identity, used his Telegram channel pretty effectively to undermine that UN pact. And we saw the result. The Austrian government actually pulled out of the agreement in the end.
It's pretty staggering how far this reaches. But how? How does a theory that's so widely debunked manage to gain so much traction, not just online, but, filtering into mainstream conversations? What are the tactics?
Well, it's kind of a multi-pronged approach, really. First, you've got figures in the media, particularly in the U.S., think conservative personalities like Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and some Republican politicians, too, who've echoed parts of it, seemingly to connect with a certain voter base.
Right.
But the really interesting thing here is how adaptable the core fear is. It's like a template, you see. It can be easily localized. You just manipulate existing social tensions in different countries.
So it resonates differently depending on the place.
Precisely. Which helps explain why it spread so widely. We've seen very similar claims pop up all over. In Australia, for instance, you had a former Senator, Fraser Anning, suggesting Muslims would, quote, outbreed us very quickly, and claiming white Australians would fast become a minority.
And it really doesn't stop there, does it? I mean, you mentioned different national contexts.
Oh, not at all. It keeps cropping up. In Ireland, there was this incident when the national broadcaster, RT News, featured the first 3 babies born in 2020. Their mothers happened to be Polish, Black, and Indian.
Okay.
And this sparked concern among some public figures, prompting a well-known journalist, Fergus Finlay, to actually condemn what he called hate mongers for stirring up hatred over it.
Wow.
Then you look at India. Hindu nationalists there have actively fanned fears about a supposed demographic erasure of Hindus by Muslims. They point to higher Muslim fertility rates, claims of forced conversions.
And Malaysia, too.
Yes. In Malaysia, you have some hard-right conservatives voicing fears that the local Indian communities might somehow oust Malay Muslims. And across Europe. Well, the theory is really central to a lot of politics there now. And figures like Marion Maréchal, Jordan Bardella, Eric Zemmour in France.
Big names.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Heinz-Christian Strache in Austria, parties like the AfD in Germany, Lega in Italy. They all sort of nod to these narratives.
Yeah.
Even interestingly, the Social Democrats in Denmark, partly due to their very tough stance on immigration, reflects some elements of this sentiment.
That's a huge global footprint for something that scholars say is debunked. So what are the specific digital strategies of propaganda tactics fueling this?
The sheer volume online is just incredible. We're talking about roughly 1.5 million tweets mentioning the Great Replacement theory between April 2012 and April 2019.
1.5 million.
Yeah, and the volume nearly tripled in just 4 years. It went from about 120,000 in 2014 to over 330,000 in 2018. Now, French accounts are dominant, but English-speaking countries made up a big chunk, almost a third, 32.76%.
And how are they spreading it? What methods?
It's a whole range. These extreme right communities use dehumanizing racist memes.
Memes?
Yes, memes are a huge part of it. They also distort and misrepresent demographic data, twist statistics, and they try to use debunked science, things that sound scientific but aren't, to give it credibility. Propagandists are actually quite clever at co-opting the grievances of different fringe communities online. They link anti-migration feelings with, say, anti-LGBT views, anti-abortion stances, general anti-establishment anger.
Kind of weaving it all together.
Exactly. They use things called red pill dumps, basically big collections of memes, like 480 memes in one dump, designed specifically to push the theory. And these appeal directly to emotion, to pre-existing prejudices, not to facts or logic.
And the debunked science part.
Yeah, they'll cite controversial or outdated academic works, things like the bell curve or race, evolution and behavior. They even make allusions to things like phrenology, the old pseudoscience about skull shapes.
Phrenology. Seriously. It's all about creating kind of veneer of legitimacy for this white nativist message. Even though the whole idea of racialism, that races have inherent fixed traits, is heavily contested and largely, debunked by modern science.
Right.
They also cherry-pick official statistics, maybe from the UN or the FBI, take them out of context, misinterpret them. Sometimes they even falsely attribute stats to official sources when they aren't.
Deceptive.
Highly. And strikingly, they use references to actual media reporting. But they twist it to suggest there's a conspiracy in the, quote, liberal press to push an anti-white agenda. They might put a headline about immigration next to one about falling birth rates, for example, or they'll deliberately highlight articles by Jewish authors to try and fuel anti-Semitism, linking it back to older conspiracy theories.
So all these elements, the origins in France, the way it spreads, these online tactics, they all lead somewhere incredibly dark, don't they? The real-world violence this theory has inspired. They absolutely do. And this is the most devastating consequence. This theory has been explicitly cited by several far-right terrorists as their motivation, including the perpetrators of the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand.
I remember that, perfect.
The 2019 El Paso shooting in the U.S., the 2022 Buffalo shooting, also in the U.S., and the 2023 Jacksonville shooting. In Christchurch, the attacker actually named his manifesto The Great Replacement. And chillingly, he live-streamed the attack. He deliberately used references to internet culture, meme-linked music, even a sort of gaming format.
Why?
To ensure his propaganda resonated online, to make it spread further faster.
God.
In Pittsburgh, the gunman who attacked the Tree of Life synagogue in 2018 He believed Jewish people were deliberately bringing non-white immigrants into the U.S. as part of a conspiracy against the white race. That explicit link again.
And Buffalo.
The 2022 shooting at the Tops Friendly Market there happened in a predominantly black neighborhood, highlighting the specific racist targeting involved.
Given these horrific events, these direct links, what kind of formal responses or condemnations have we seen from official bodies or scholars pushing back?
Well, formal condemnations have started to happen, though some argue maybe not strongly or widely enough.
Yeah.
But a really powerful example comes from the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. They issued a specific resolution in condemnation of the promotion and celebration of the Great Replacement theory.
What did they say?
They stated very clearly that the theory, quote, only serves to fuel intolerance, generate fear and aggression, instigate acts of violence against people of color, and impair the ability to implement rational immigration policy.
Strange words.
Very. The commission also emphasized that the U.S. was, quote, founded as a collection of immigrants, and that rights, privileges, liberty, these things are universal. They're not reserved for any one race or ethnic group. So they called on leaders to eschew resisting and confronting the theory using intellectually honest debate.
And this echoes the scholarly points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It lines up with the scholarly debunking, which shows point by point how the theory just plays fast and loose with the statistics.
Mm-hmm.
How it wrongly classes people actually born in France as immigrants, for example.
Right.
How it conveniently ignores that about half of immigrants to France are actually from other European countries, and how it suggests, that the indigenous French population is being outbred by Muslim newcomers, when in fact France has the highest fertility rate in Western Europe, and that's not primarily driven by immigration. The facts just don't support the theory.
Okay, this brings us to maybe a more complex, more nuanced angle on how society should respond to these ideologies. There's a recent paper out of Harvard University that discusses some concerns, both theoretical and practical, about framing white supremacy mainly as terrorism. Now, this next point is really quite interesting because it raises a specific fear. The fear is that focusing only on counter-radicalizing white supremacists might actually inadvertently cause harm to communities of color who are already over-policed, specifically Muslim communities in the U.S., who were the main targets of the whole war on counterterrorism setup. So this perspective argues that white supremacy isn't necessarily something outside the state, but rather it's been kind of intrinsic to American nation building, to the state's efforts to socially control different populations throughout history. You can look back at, mass casualties aimed at displacing indigenous peoples, the Trail of Tears, for example, or the brutal slave patrol system, or the KKK's long history of violence against Black Americans, and even against, say, Chinese immigrants, like the awful 1871 mass lynching in Los Angeles. And it points out how even legislation, like the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, ADPA,
Passed after Oklahoma City, right?
exactly, passed after what was then the deadliest act of white supremacist violence on U.S. soil. But that act ended up primarily targeting marginalized communities, like Black prisoners or non-citizens with minor offenses, not really the white supremacist groups it was supposedly responding to.
And that really highlights a huge challenge, doesn't it? The sources point out that the massive expansion of the whole national security apparatus after 9/11, things like joint terrorism task forces, fusion centers, plus this whole cottage industry, as they call it, of terrorism experts who might have financial incentives. All this creates a system that can end up targeting communities that have historically been marginalized and prosecuted, while at the same time perhaps allowing white supremacist ideology itself to kind of grow and fester with less direct focus.
A difficult balance.
Yeah. Extremely. And this connects back to the mainstreaming point we discussed earlier. The sources specifically cite the rise of former U.S. President Donald Trump as a factor here, arguing that his rhetoric, things like calling migrants invaders or implicitly seeming to support narratives about white genocide, helped to normalize these really dangerous ideas in broader public discussion.
Wow, what a truly complex and, yeah, at times pretty unsettling deep dive this has been. We've seen how this theory, even though experts dismiss it, can really take root and spread globally, fueled by very specific tactics, finding its way into political language and, tragically, into real-world violence. Understanding where it came from and how it works is so crucial. But it also raises this really important question, doesn't it, about how we, as a society, actually confront these narratives effectively without unintentionally causing more harm to communities that are already vulnerable.
Absolutely. If you try to connect this to the bigger picture, it just underscores how vital information literacy and critical thinking are, especially now in this age of just constant information overload. The great replacement theory is such a stark example of how easily data can be twisted, how emotions can be manipulated to push really, really harmful ideologies. So maybe the question this leaves for you, the listener, is this: how do you evaluate the flood of information you encounter every single day? And what responsibility do you feel personally in challenging narratives that seem designed to exploit fear and sow division?